The astonishing speed with which Adolf Hitler's Germany expanded its territory between 1938 and 1941 was not a sudden accident of history. It was the result of a meticulously constructed chain of events where each link was forged from the one that came before it. To truly understand how this 4-year land grab occurred, we must examine a timeline of causes and their direct effects. The process began long before the first tanks crossed a foreign border, rooted in the deep resentments of post-World War I Germany. This essay will trace that path, starting with the conditions that allowed for the rise of Nazism through the consolidation of Hitler's power, his calculated diplomatic maneuvers, and finally the unleashing of a new and terrifying form of warfare that brought much of Europe to its knees in a remarkably short period. The story of Hitler's expansion begins in the ashes of the German Empire. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to secure peace, but for many Germans it felt like national humiliation. The treaty imposed a heavy burden. The War Guilt Clause forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for World War I. It demanded crippling financial reparations, stripped Germany of its overseas colonies, ceded territories across Europe, Alsace-Lorraine to France. That created a widespread sense of injustice that festered through the 1920s and early 1930s. The economic consequences were severe. Reparations, plus loss of industrial regions like the Saar Basin, crippled the economy. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s wiped out middle-class savings. Scenes of social dislocation and hardship. The economy stabilized briefly, but stayed vulnerable. Then the Great Depression hit in 1929. Mass unemployment and business failures followed. Poverty became rampant. Public faith in the Weimar Republic collapsed. Political parties were fractured and stuck in weak coalitions. People lost trust in democracy and wanted a strong leader. Charismatic figures offering simple answers gained ground. Hitler and the Nazi Party exploited this anger and despair. Their propaganda attacked the November criminals and the Treaty of Versailles. They promised to tear up the treaty, rebuild the military, restore Germany's honor. They offered jobs to the unemployed and a return to traditional values. For many Germans, those promises were irresistible. When Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, he did not immediately launch foreign conquests. His first priority was to secure absolute control within Germany itself. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the perfect pretext. Hitler persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree. The decree suspended basic civil liberties like freedom of speech, assembly, the press. The decree legalized the Nazi campaign of terror against political opponents. Opponents were arrested, imprisoned, silenced by the thousands, creating a climate of fear. With opponents neutralized, Hitler solidified his legal authority through the Enabling Act of March 1933. The law allowed his government to pass laws without the Reichstag for 4 years, effectively making him a dictator. One by one, other political parties were banned, forced to dissolve, leaving the Nazi Party the sole legal political entity by July. He then moved to bring all aspects of society under Nazi control, Gleichschaltung. While consolidating power, Hitler began secret, then open, rearmament. The Treaty of Versailles had limited the army to 100,000 men and forbade an air force, tanks, submarines. He withdrew Germany from the League of Nations and the World Disarmament Conference. Huge sums were funneled into military spending. Factories were retooled to produce rifles, artillery, aircraft, armored vehicles. In March 1935, Hitler publicly announced conscription, aiming for an army of over 500,000 men. Rearmament prepared Germany for war and helped solve unemployment. Public works like the Autobahn were launched, stimulating the economy, creating jobs. For many Germans, the regime appeared to deliver work and national revival. Visible economic recovery and restored military might generated popular support for Hitler. By 1936, he was undisputed master of Germany and commander of a rapidly modernizing military. The foundation for external expansion was now firmly in place. The first major test of Hitler's foreign policy and the resolve of the Western powers came on March 7, 1936. On that day, he ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland. The demilitarized zone lay on Germany's western border. This was a flagrant violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties. Hitler's move was an immense gamble. His generals were nervous. The army was no match for France. Hitler had correctly judged the political climate in Britain and France. He timed his move carefully, framing it as a defensive response, specifically to the Franco-Soviet pact. The French government was politically divided and in a financial crisis, reluctant to act without firm British support. British public opinion was largely sympathetic to Germany. Lord Lothian said Germany was going into their own back garden. Faced with reluctance and division, France failed to act, lodging only a protest at the League of Nations. Britain did the same. Hitler offered a sham peace proposal, further encouraging Western inaction. The lack of a forceful response was a pivotal moment. The remilitarization secured the Ruhr and enabled construction of the Siegfried Line. The success boosted Hitler's prestige and reinforced his belief that intuition beat caution. He faced down Western democracies and won, seeing them as weak and unwilling to fight. After the triumph in the Rhineland, Hitler's confidence soared, and he turned his attention to his native Austria. The unification of Germany and Austria, known as the Anschluss, had been a long-held dream of German nationalists and a core tenet of Hitler's ideology, Mein Kampf. He viewed Austrians as fellow Germans who belonged in a greater Reich. The Austrian Nazi Party, funded and directed from Berlin, used violence and intimidation. In February 1938, Hitler summoned Schuschnigg to Berchtesgaden and subjected him to threats and intimidation. He demanded Nazis in key posts, including the Interior Ministry. Faced with invasion threats, Schuschnigg agreed. Back in Vienna, Schuschnigg announced a plebiscite. This infuriated Hitler. A popular vote could ruin his pretext. On March 11th, Hitler issued an ultimatum: cancel and resign in favor of Arthur Seyss-Inquart. With no help from France or Britain, and Mussolini aligned, Schuschnigg resigned. Seyss-Inquart invited German troops. On March 12, 1938, forces crossed the border, meeting no resistance. The Anschluss was a resounding success. Annexation without a shot, amplified by propaganda. The annexation gave Germany new resources, gold reserves, iron ore, and a large boost in manpower. Britain and France issued protests, but neither acted, confirming Hitler he could expand with little fear of reprisal. With Austria absorbed into the Reich, Hitler's next target was Czechoslovakia. This democratic and prosperous nation, created after World War I, was a strategic obstacle with a modern army and strong border defenses. It possessed alliances with France and the Soviet Union. Hitler's pretext was alleged persecution of 3 million ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland, a mountainous border region. Orchestrated by Konrad Henlein and directed by Berlin, a propaganda campaign fabricated atrocities to justify intervention. Throughout the summer, tensions escalated as impossible demands were made of Prague. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, haunted by World War I, pursued appeasement, believing Hitler's grievances were limited and Versailles unjust. Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in September 1938. At Munich, September 29th and 30th, Chamberlain, Daladier, and Mussolini agreed that Czechoslovakia must cede the Sudetenland to Germany immediately. Czechoslovak representatives were not invited. They were told resistance meant facing Germany alone. Chamberlain returned to London, famously declaring he had secured, peace for our time. Consequences were catastrophic. Dismemberment, loss of defenses, a third of population, and key industry including Skoda works. For Hitler, Munich was his greatest triumph, confirming his contempt for Western leaders and emboldening further aggression. The Munich Agreement assumed Hitler sought only German-speaking lands. Chamberlain took Hitler at his word, but Hitler intended the destruction of the Czechoslovak state. He saw it as an aircraft carrier for the Soviet Union and an artificial creation of Versailles. After Munich, he incited separatists among Slovaks and Ruthenians and amplified chaos with propaganda. On March 14th, Slovaks declared independence. That night, President Emil Hácha was bullied in Berlin. Göring threatened Prague with bombing. Hácha collapsed and signed away his country. On March 15th, German troops marched into Prague without resistance. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. This conquest shocked the world. For the first time, Hitler had conquered a non-German people. Appeasement was destroyed as British opinions swung against him. The seizure was the point of no return. Britain and France now saw war as inevitable. The expansionist policies were central to Nazi ideology. The concept of Lebensraum demanded new lands, particularly in the East. This created momentum that made subsequent steps seem inevitable, yet planted seeds of eventual failure even within early victories. After the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, Poland became the obvious next target. Hitler demanded the return of Danzig and an extraterritorial link across the Polish corridor. Britain and France issued a formal guarantee of Poland's independence. A two-front war was the greatest strategic risk. For Hitler, the guarantee was a challenge to overcome. Despite anti-communist rhetoric, Hitler opened secret talks with Stalin, who distrusted the West after Munich. The Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact pledged mutual non-attack for 10 years. A secret protocol carved up Eastern Europe. Poland partitioned, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and later Lithuania to the Soviet sphere. It was a true devil's bargain that stunned the world. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler gave the final order. German forces invaded Poland from the north, south, and west, without a formal declaration of war. This time there would be no conference and no appeasement. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. The invasion of Poland unveiled a terrifying new method of warfare: blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was not a single tactic, but a combined arms strategy for rapid, decisive victory, avoiding World War I trench warfare. The concept relied on close coordination of fast-moving armored divisions, motorized infantry, tactical air power, and dive bombers like the Junkers Ju-87, the Stuka. Panzers concentrated force to punch through weak points, bypass strongholds, and drive into rear areas. Their goal: sow chaos, disrupt communications, encircle enemy armies, collapse command and control. In Poland, blitzkrieg was devastating. The Polish army was technologically and strategically outmatched. Reliance on infantry and cavalry spread thin, and Luftwaffe bombing of airfields, rails, and communications sealed the outcome. Within a week, panzers neared Warsaw. On September 17th, the Soviets invaded from the east. Poland was partitioned. After the phony war, Germany struck north, then on May 10th drove through the Ardennes, outflanking the Maginot Line. The Allies expected a Schlieffen repeat and concentrated forces farther north, into a trap. German panzers burst from the Ardennes. Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel. They raced to the Channel, outmaneuvered Allied forces, and trapped the BEF and much of the French army at Dunkirk. The Dunkirk evacuation saved over 300,000 soldiers, but left heavy equipment behind. With its best armies shattered, France's resistance collapsed. German troops entered Paris on June 14th. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice in the same railway carriage as 1918. In 6 weeks, Hitler conquered France and the Low Countries, what the German Empire had failed to do in 4 years. By following this cause and effect structure, we gain a humane understanding of how such rapid, devastating expansion was achieved, and how the seeds of its eventual failure were sown even within its earliest victories, as of our perspective today on October 9, 2025.